Well, hey, good morning. How we doing? All right. Hey, really quick. I know we don't normally do this, but take just a second and why don't you just greet somebody nearby? Don't shake hands. It's flu season. Nobody wants to share that stuff. Fist bump somebody. Tell them you're glad to see them this morning. Say, wake up. Well, we started a series last week that I've been really excited about for a while, a series called Jailbreak, and we're just taking a few weeks and we're talking about forgiveness. And the thought behind the jailbreak idea is this. It's that when you are in a place where there's somebody you need to forgive, it's like you're in a prison cell, right? Like you can't experience freedom the way that God wants you to experience it because there's this thing in your life that you got to deal with. And so that's the idea behind this series. And I've been excited about this for a while because I think forgiveness is something that we can all be better at. Amen? Forgiveness is something that we can all be a little bit better at. Man, if you scroll Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any social media for a couple of minutes, you walk away feeling that. We all need to be a little better at this thing, at grace and at forgiveness. And so that's what we're talking about. But today we're going to talk about maybe like a take on forgiveness that isn't something we typically talk about, or maybe you don't typically think of it this way when you hear that word. And so hopefully today is meaningful for you because I think this is something that every single one of us in the room this morning has wrestled with at some time or another, and maybe many of you are wrestling with this now. And so hopefully this is meaningful. Let me start here, all right? So one of my favorite things about my job is that occasionally I'll get a call and somebody will ask me to come and speak somewhere, to go be a part of, maybe I'm guest speaking at another church or a part of an event somewhere or something like that. I love getting to do that. And so a few years ago, I got a call like that. Somebody asked me to come and be a part of an event they had going on in Virginia. And I asked them what it was about. And they said, well, the theme for the whole weekend is just grace. It's just starting over. It's clean slate, it's fresh start with Jesus. And I said, count me in. That sounds awesome. And so it started on a Friday. I got there and I was getting ready to speak in the opening session. The band was on stage. They're killing it. The worship was so good. And I was really, really excited to start this thing off. And so my talk this first night, they had asked me specifically to teach through the section of scripture where Jesus uses this idea of starting a relationship with God. He says it's like you're being born again. And they wanted me to explain what that meant. So I was like, that sounds great, let's do it. And so I walk out to start the first talk. And when I walked out there, I thought, this is even better because right there in the front row was this lady who was very obviously pregnant. Like she was about to pop. And so in my young and probably naive and stupid thought process, I was like, I'm gonna point this out and I'm gonna use this as like an illustration in my talk. This will be great. And so I get going, I'm a couple minutes into my talk and I was like, man, isn't New Life awesome? It's just so exciting. Like how excited are you for your baby to, like when are you due? And she looked at me and she said 3 words that have lived in my nightmares for years. You wanna guess? She said, I'm not pregnant. I wish I could tell you that it didn't get worse, but it does. Because, see, the lights were really bright. I couldn't see very well, but when I heard the voice, it hit me. This was a man. So I don't remember a lot about the next 30 minutes of my life. I don't know how I recovered, if I recovered. It probably wasn't pretty. I didn't make any eye contact with the front row the rest of the night, and none of them sat on the front row the rest of the weekend, and they've never asked me to come back and speak at that event. I don't know if that's why. I've never been asked to come back. So it was obviously one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. And if I ask you what yours are, I'll bet you have a story that flashes in your mind, right? I'll bet you have a memory that comes rushing back of some embarrassing encounter, embarrassing experience, because we've all had those moments. My wife will tell you I stick my foot in my mouth all the time. I do it constantly. You might do that too. Maybe you've written a text and you fired it off to somebody. You thought it was going to that person, but you accidentally sent it to the person the text was about. You ever done that before? Oh, that's no fun. Or maybe like guys, you told your wife her new haircut looks fine. Big mistake. right? You don't do that. One of the things I'm the worst at is, I'll just be honest, I'm way more comfortable like here than I am if I randomly run into somebody that I know in public. And so some of you in the room, I'm sure I've had that experience where I've run into you somewhere and you know I'm super socially awkward if you've had that encounter with me. And so I just want you to know that if we've ever had that awkward encounter, I'm gonna think about that at least once a day for the next 20 or 30 years. Maybe you're like that too. Whatever it is, we all understand embarrassment. That's a normal human emotion, and we've all been there. But what we're gonna talk about today is like a deeper level, okay? It's not embarrassment, it's something deeper. It's something that hangs with us. It's something that we don't get over quickly. And it has something more to do with our identities than just embarrassment, right? And I wanna be clear from the get-go that what we're not talking about is guilt. We're not talking about guilt. We're gonna talk today a little bit about shame. And there is a big difference between those two things. And let me explain. Guilt is something that I feel when I do something that hurts you. Guilt is something I feel when I realize I've done something that's wounded you or harmed you or been unfair to you, and I understand that my actions are the result of your hurt. I feel guilt. That's guilt, okay? Shame is how I feel about me because of my actions. Does that make sense? So guilt, I feel because I've done something that's hurt you. Shame, I feel because I understand or I believe something about me because of those things. And the way shame works is it's like a lie that we tell ourselves over and over and over. You wake up in the morning and you look at yourself in the mirror and you tell yourself these lies again. You're stupid. Nobody likes you. Look at the mess that you made. Look what you did. Look what you caused. Look what you created. How could you hurt somebody that bad? They can't possibly like you anymore. Nobody wants you around. Gosh, you're useless. You're way too broken for anybody to love you. You couldn't possibly. Do any of these things sound familiar? These are lies that we tell ourselves over and over and over, and they're all rooted in shame. And shame is like a cycle. It's like a whirlpool that you get caught in and you can't get out of. It's like every day that you wake up and you tell yourself those things, you believe them a little bit more somewhere in your core, and they no longer become just these things that you may have heard or believed about yourself. Now they're like part of your identity. And once they become part of your identity, they get so deeply rooted in your life that you just have a hard time figuring out how to handle it. And it becomes very difficult to figure out what to do with those things. And here's the thing, like shame is so crippling. Psychologists tell us that this meteoric rise in anxiety and stress and suicide in our culture is directly tied to shame. In fact, physicians will tell you that a lot of physical ailments are closely related to shame. And they'll tell you that if we could figure out a way to ease this problem of shame in our society, that many of our hospital beds would be empty. Shame is crippling. It is so difficult, and Satan wants you to live there. He wants you to hold on to that shame. He wants that to be your identity. But what I want you to know this morning, if you're somebody who's dealing with shame in your life, is that God does not want that for you. He wants something very different for you. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's the idea that God doesn't want you to live with shame. Jesus said, I've come that you could have life and that you could have it to the full. And that's exactly what that means. It's life without guilt and without shame. It's life in freedom because you understand that you're forgiven and there's grace and there's mercy for you. That is what life to the full is all about. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and open up to Luke chapter 15. And we're going to kind of camp out in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11 today. We'll put these verses on the screen, but if you like to take notes or if you want to read along, that's where we'll be. What's happening in this passage is Jesus is doing what he often does. A crowd is gathered and he's beginning to teach. And the reason he does this, let me kind of give you some context and paint a picture for you. I try to be intentional about doing this, okay? So the Bible is not a book. The Bible is actually a collection of books and letters and these ancient documents that were written by people that we believe God inspired. And he directed them to write the things that they wrote. And so these things were handed down generation after generation after generation after generation. And over time, these things were compiled and they were assembled into what we call the Bible now. And it's split in two sections. You have the Old Testament that tracks with God's people from creation all the way through the coming of Jesus, who was this Messiah that was promised. And then you have the New Testament that picks up right there and it tells the story of Jesus' life and of the start of the church. And there's these letters that were written to you and me as the church to teach us us how to live and how to function together as the church to make a difference in the world. And so the whole thing works together to tell this story of how God's been working in the world throughout time. And in the New Testament, right where it starts, you have these 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we call those the Gospels. The word gospel means good news. These are the books that tell the story of Jesus. It's the good news of who he is and what he came to do for you and in your life and through you. And we're gonna be in Luke today, which is the third of those Gospels, and it's my favorite of the 4. I love the book of Luke, and this story is one of my favorites from the book of Luke. So we're gonna take a few minutes, starting in verse 11, and I'm gonna tell you this story, and we're just gonna break it down a little bit and pull some things from it that might help us deal with the shame that many of us wrestle with in our life. So here's the way it starts. Jesus starts telling this story, helping people understand a little more about God, and he does it through an illustration that goes like this. He says, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And so he divided his property between them. He just says, all right, here's your part. Well, not too long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and he set off for a distant country. And there he squandered his wealth on wild living. Now, just time out right there. I don't know if you can relate to that, but I can. I can, because we've all made decisions that were foolish, right? And you could blame it on one thing or another. You might look back at your life and you might say, I made some stupid decisions. I was young, I didn't have a lot of life experience to draw from, or there were just things going on in my life you don't understand. There were just circumstances at work, and I did some things I regret, and you make excuses for it, right? And that's what shame does. It leads us to make excuses. It leads us to project the cause of our shame onto other people and say, oh, it was their fault. It wasn't my fault. It was because something was going on. That's what shame does. Whatever reason it is that this happens to this, where he finds himself, this son in our stories, he finds himself broke. And he finds himself alone. That's what we find out next. It says, after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. And all his friends left him, so he's alone. So he went out and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. This is how bad it got for the son. It says he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. Imagine being that desperate, that your job is to feed waste, like food waste and slop to the pigs, and you're sitting there thinking a bowl of that wouldn't be that bad right now. It sounds gross, but that's where the son is. He's lonely and he's starving and he's broke and he has nowhere to go. And maybe some of you can relate to that. Maybe you haven't been there in a literal sense, but how about in a spiritual sense? You ever found yourself so far from God and so far from home that you just thought, I don't even know how to get back there anymore? Maybe it's like, it's been so long since I've prayed, I'm not even sure how to do that. And even if I did, would God want to hear anything I have to say? Because he's got to just think, man, it's been too long. Have you ever found yourself in that place where you're just alone, you feel lonely and just spiritually broke and starving? Sometimes we run away from God intentionally. Like some of you, you've had something happen in your life, a circumstance or something painful, and you've blamed that on God, and you said, all right, you know what, I've had enough. And so you pack your bags and off you go. And for some of us, it's an intentional thing. But for others of us, it's a slow fade. Like you didn't set out one day to walk away from God. It just happened over time. It happened very gradually. And one day you wake up and you realize that God is far away, and you never meant to go to that place. It's like eating at Denny's. Nobody goes there on purpose. But you find yourself there full of regret, right? That's where many of us end up. It's not like we meant to go there. It just happened over time. And we wind up full of regret. That's where the young son finds himself. But what I want you to notice in this story is this. Instead of going home, where he'd have a roof over his head, maybe some real food to eat, instead of going home, he stays where he is. He continues to live in this cycle. He continues day after day after day after day to go through this routine, and nothing changes. Why would he do that? Why, when things are so bad, would he continue to live in this? Let me tell you why. Shame. He had dishonored his father, brought shame on his family, took all his money and he blew it. All his friends abandoned him. And here's what's going through his head. You ready? He wakes up and he looks at himself in the mirror and he thinks, gosh, nobody would love me. No, nobody would want me. I'm so stupid. Look what a mess I've made in my life. Nobody could possibly love. Nobody wants me around. He tells himself these things over and over until he believes it and it becomes his identity. And here is something that is so true. It was this mistake that separated him from his dad. It was a shame that kept him separated. And just like that in your life and in my life, it's sin that separates us from God, but it's our shame that keeps us separated from him. It's our shame that keeps us running from him. And just like the son in our story, we begin to believe these things about ourselves, and it's no longer a thing you did. It becomes this belief that it's who you are. And that is exactly what Jesus said, I have come to undo. That is exactly what Jesus said. I've come so that that isn't your life. I've come so that that's not what's true about you. That's not who you are. He said, that is exactly why I'm here. So here's what happens in our story. I love the way this plays out. Picking back up, it says, when he came to his senses, in other words, his head pops off the pillow one day and he looks at his life, he looks at the circumstances around him and he goes, what in the world have I done? And he came to his senses. And so he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and I'll go back to my father and I'll say to him, and he starts to work up this speech, right? Because again, he believes his father couldn't possibly want anything to do with him. And so he starts to work up this speech in his head and he's like, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So make me like one of your hired servants. He's like, yeah, maybe that'll work. And so he got up and he went home. Listen, the journey out of shame is exactly that. It is a journey. It's not a moment. It's not a switch that flips. It's not a single decision that you make. It's not like you wake up one day and you're like, I'm done with shame today. It can take weeks and months and years and years and years and years for some of us. It is a journey. But looking at this example of the son in this story, and this is part of the reason I think Jesus told this story. I think he told us this story because he wants us to know some things about God, but I also think he told this story because he wants us to know some things about how to return, about how to walk out of shame, about how to go home. And so here's some things I think we see in here. The first thing that we see the son do is he acknowledges the cause of his shame. And psychologists say it this way. They say you've got to bring your shame into the light because shame creates this darkness around you, and that's where you want to hide when you're ashamed of something. Think back to when you were a little kid and you got in trouble, and so you went and hid like under your bed or in a closet or outside in the woods or something, and you like ran, right? That's what shame does. It creates this darkness, and psychologists say the first thing you've got to do if you're going to deal with your shame and journey out of it is you've got to bring it into the light. And here's what that means. It means you own it. It means you don't make excuses for it. You don't sweep it under the rug. You don't project it on other people and say, oh, it's their fault. You don't do that. You own it. I love what David wrote in Psalm chapter 32. He said, then I acknowledged my sin to you, God, and you did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Listen, if you want to journey out of shame, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to bring it into the light. You've got to confess what you did. Confess it to God, confess it to the person that you hurt, and seek forgiveness. That's part one. You have to bring it into the light. You have to own it. But as you do, you have to do this. We see the son do this. You have to do this. You have to understand that Jesus is not disgusted by your dirt. He's not put off by your issues. Jesus is not scared of your brokenness. No matter how broken you think you might be, he's not scared of it. In fact, with enough time, it's possible he may even want to use that in your life to help someone else find healing down the road. See, where we see pain, Jesus sees potential. Where we see an issue, he sees an opportunity to make a difference. And if you will give him your mess, he will turn it into a message, a testimony of the grace of God that will speak volumes, much, much more than I could do from a stage. Your life will speak volumes to the people around you about how good God is and about how great his love is. And you have to understand before that can take place that he's not scared of the issues in your life. Again, in Psalms chapter 103, David writes this. He says, he doesn't treat us as our sins deserve or repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. So understand he loves you and he will not turn you away because of something in your life that feels dirty or broken to you. Again, he just sees an opportunity there to demonstrate how good his grace is and how true his forgiveness is. Here's another thing we see in this example of the son, and this is so critical. If you're gonna journey out of shame, once you brought it into the light, you begin to understand, this is like he's not afraid of my brokenness. He's not afraid of my issues. He doesn't hate me for those things. This is the thing about shame is a tool that Satan loves to use to whisper lies against those truths. It's one thing to know in your head that God loves you. It's another thing to know it in your heart. And so as you're trying to take this head knowledge and you're trying to make it heart knowledge, you're trying to take it like from this thing that you've heard to this thing that you really believe at the core of who you are, what you have to do is this. This is the third thing. You can't try to walk it out alone. Because if you try to walk it out alone, it is you in the middle of your mess doing battle against Satan, who's gonna constantly tell you all those things you believe about yourself are true. And so you can't try to walk it out alone. You have to get some people around you who love God and love you, who will encourage you and support you and point you in the right direction and keep you from backsliding into that whirlpool. You have to get some accountability in your life. Again, some people who will speak truth to you and hold you accountable in love and with grace. You have to have that community around you. And listen, that's what church is for. Church isn't just a room that you come and sit in on Sunday morning, sing a few songs, and hear somebody talk about some. Church is community for people who need community. It's a family for people who need family. It's accountability for people who need accountability. And so let me just ask you, if this is something that you're wrestling with in your life, have you taken a step to get into that kind of community? Are you in a life group? Have you sought out mentoring? Students, are you in our student ministry? Are you connected to a community of people who are gonna have your back? Listen to what James chapter 5 says. It says, therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed, because the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And what that means is something powerful and healing happens when you confess what you've done to somebody and you ask them to simply pray for you. So are you doing that? Because you can't walk out this journey alone. And then here's the final thing. You just got to take one step at a time. If you decide today, I want to journey out of my shame, I've got to deal with this stuff, you can't expect to wake up tomorrow and everything be better. Again, sometimes it takes years, but that's okay. And if you still feel like crap tomorrow, you are not doing it wrong. You have to take one step at a time. One day at a time. And it starts with a single step. That's exactly what we see the son in our story do. It says he went home. He went back to his father. And then here's what happens next. It says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion. Just think about that. While the son was still a long way off, the father saw him. Do you know what that means? It means this. It means that while the son is over here and he's living in his shame and he's living in his brokenness and he's like, I've screwed everything up and I can't clean up the mess and my father couldn't possibly want anything to do with me. And so I'm just gonna stay over here in my shame. It means that the whole time that the son is here and he's living in that and he's telling himself those things, it means that somewhere over here, somewhere home, the father is standing here and he doesn't have his back turned to the son. Instead, he's waiting. And he's watching every single day. I imagine he walks out the front door and he steps on the front porch and he's looking down the road and he doesn't see him, so he takes a couple steps into the front yard and he's watching and he doesn't see him, so he takes a couple steps down the driveway and he doesn't see him, so he walks out to the father is looking for the son. So much that when the son was still a long way off, it's not just that the father saw a person, it's that he saw him and he knew it was him. And look what he does. It says he ran to him. He didn't wait for him to get to, he's not standing on the front porch with his arms crossed, tapping his foot, waiting for the son to get there. He couldn't contain it. He saw the son coming down the road, and so he took off. There's tears coming down his cheeks because his son has come home. It says he was filled with compassion. He ran to his son. He threw his arms around him and he kissed him. And the son immediately goes into this speech that he's rehearsed. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And I love this because the father doesn't even acknowledge that. He's like, shut up, we'll deal with that later. Quick, he tells the servants, go, bring the best robe and put it on, and bring a ring and put it on his finger, and put sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. And check this out. They began to celebrate. They began to celebrate. There's no time for apologies right now. We have a party to throw. That's what the Father does. Do you know that your heavenly Father is not standing on the front porch with his arms crossed, tapping his foot, waiting for you to show up so he can scold you for what you did? If you feel far from God, if there is something broken in your life that's heavy, he is not waiting for you to come home so he can yell at you, ground you, put you in spiritual detention. That's not God. Jesus tells us this story so we would know that that's true. Instead, he says, your Father is waiting for you to come home. And so here's what I want you to hear this morning. Stop running. Some of you, you come in here week after week after week, and you show up to church because you're checking some kind of box in your life. But if we're being honest, you're just physically present. Spiritually, you've been running for years. And maybe today God is saying, stop running from me. Stop running from me. Stop living in shame. Stop believing those things about yourself. I sent Jesus to take that shame. I sent Jesus to deal with that sin. I sent Jesus to give you a new identity so that that's not who you are anymore. So stop believing it. And when you wake up and you look at yourself in the mirror, don't tell yourself those things. You look at yourself in the mirror, just like we sang a few minutes ago, and you say, I'm a child of God. I am who you say I am, God. I am a child of God. I'm not my mistakes. I'm not my past. I'm not that relationship I screwed up. I'm not that marriage I screwed up. That's not me. I'm a child of God. That's what he wants you to believe about yourself. So listen, you may feel like the biggest disappointment on earth. You may feel betrayed and broken and useless. You may have even thought at some point that the people that you love the most would be better off if you weren't around. You may be lost, but I'm telling you, you can be found. You can be found. But what you've got to do is you've got to not let your past define you. Because God has already promised you that he's forgiven those things, and now you've got to be willing to step out of your shame and forgive yourself for those things. Stop beating yourself up for things that God has long forgotten. Don't let your past define you, because it doesn't diminish his ability to do ministry in your life, and it doesn't diminish the purpose that God has for your life. He wants to do something great through you. And he doesn't want you to live in that prison cell anymore, okay? Instead, he has freedom for you. He wants you to have freedom in your life. In his book, Pursued, Judd Wilhite put it this way. I want to read you this quote. He wrote, perhaps it's time to look beyond your frustrations and your fatigue and your list of sins and see again the God who continues to pursue you. His arms, he's not sitting back with his arms crossed, waiting to see if you can pull it together. And he's not trying to convert you so you can just go to church and be good and make your mama happy. Jesus didn't die so you could only perform your religious duties. He died so you could be in a divine relationship with a living God who loves you like a perfect Father. And God will not give up on you. So next time you look in the mirror and you're tempted to see the junk of the past, remind yourself that you are someone who's been rescued and set free and liberated and given the ultimate chance to live again. I'm sitting here in a cell at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, and you might recognize this place
as the primary filming location for the Shawshank Redemption. But long before this was a setting for movies and music videos and photo shoots, this was a fully functioning reformatory prison. For 94 years, from 1896 to 1990, more than 154,000 prisoners passed through these cell blocks. And this was where you sent the guys that smaller or lower security prisons couldn't handle. And for a while, this was even where death row prisoners were sent to wait for their execution. And I've got to tell you, it's a weird feeling being here. It's so quiet that it's a little bit eerie. All you really hear is the wind howling through the steam pipes and the old chimneys. And some say this place is haunted by the ghosts of prisoners who died here, but I don't think that's it. I think there's a heaviness that you feel just being here, walking through these halls. You can't help but imagine how hopeless it would have been to be a prisoner here. I mean, sure, if you were here, there was a good reason for it, but this is a dark, really cold, sad place. In the Shawshank Redemption, there's a character named Brooks. He's an older man who's really kind and really nice to everyone. He's just a good guy. He'd been a prisoner at Shawshank for decades, but he'd earned the trust of the warden and the guards over time, and he was put in charge of running the prison library. He had been in prison for so long that every other part of his life outside of this place had long since slipped away. His friends and family were other prisoners. His whole life was inside these walls. Well, eventually the time came that Brooks' sentence was complete, and they told him he was free to go. But when he made it out, he didn't know what to do. Everything he knew was found here, and he'd grown so used to life as a captive that he didn't know how to be free anymore. Red, who was played by Morgan Freeman, put it this way, and I thought this was really profound. He said, these walls are funny. First you hate them, and then you get used to them, and enough time passes, you depend on them. And he said, they send you here for life, and that's exactly what they take from you. Well, that's exactly what shame does in your life. It robs you of the part of your life that really matters, and when you live with it long enough, it just becomes a part of who you are. It becomes your identity. And before you realize it, you're so used to life as a captive that you don't know how to be free. If that's where you find yourself today, I want you to know that Jesus has hope for you. Romans chapter 3 says that every single person has sinned and fallen short of God's glory. And Romans chapter 6 says that the punishment for that, the wages, what we deserve for our sin is death. But my favorite part is in Romans chapter 8, where we read that if we've put our faith and trust in Jesus, there is no more condemnation for us. We're free. The cell door is swung wide open by God's grace because of what Jesus did for us on the cross, and we're offered freedom in exchange for our prison bars. But while the doors are wide open and there's nothing holding us in this cell, many of us willingly choose to stay right where we are. Rather than accepting the freedom that we find in Jesus, we just keep right on living as if we're prisoners of our guilt and our shame. But in John chapter 8, Jesus has a good word for you. He says, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs forever. And so if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. And friends, the Son has set you free. He set you free. You are free indeed. And He's inviting you to step out of your prison, to be free of your chains, and to live a fulfilled life as a son and daughter of God. Maybe it sounds strange because as heavy as it is being here in this place and as hopeless of a place as this is, there's also a weird feeling of hope here. There's a feeling of hope because these doors are wide open and this place won't ever hold anybody captive again. There's a weird feeling of hope here because all of the hopeless days are in the past. And so are yours. So today, stop carrying the guilt that you've been carrying and stop living with the shame you've been living with and step into the freedom that Jesus offers you as a son or daughter of the King. Step into the life that He offers you. Because the Son has set you free, and you are free indeed.